Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne, and Noel has published widely on the history of popular music, including a book co-written with Martin McLaughlin on rock and popular music in Ireland before and after U2, which came out with Irish Academic Press in 2012. And then our second speaker is Joanna Braniff, who's an independent scholar based in Belfast and who works as a freelance author, journalist and media consultant specializing in arts and culture. And Joanna and Noel jointly are the authors of a brand new book called How Belfast Got the Blues, A Cultural History of Popular Music in the 1960s, which has just been published at the end of 2020 by Intellect Books in the UK and the University of Chicago Press in the US. And this book explores what they argue very cogently is the central importance of Belfast in the development of the broader phenomenon of popular music and politics in the 1960s. It is a fantastic read. I'd recommend it very strongly. Noel and Joanna this afternoon are going to talk to us about one of the themes which they address in the book, which has the title The Politician and the Showman, History, Politics and Popular Music in 1960s Northern Ireland. So I think I'm going to pass over to Noel and Joanna, who are going to alternate as speakers and take it from here.
Thank you, Peter.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. Okay then, so pop in politics. Well, whether aware of it or not, one often approaches this topic through a pre-existing discursive interpretive grid. The governing terms of rock evaluation, I think, entered the fray here. Is so-and-so selling out? And correspondingly, who is selling in? Leaving aside that there are other ways of interpreting the relationship beyond the narrow terms of so-and-so selling out and selling in, we accept the frame of reference. Many of us then relish the moments when the apparent falsity of the relationship between the politician and the performer breaks down, such as Gordon Brown's apparent love of the Arctic monkeys and the fact when pressed in 2006 he couldn't name a single track by the group, or Gordon Brown's controversial love of the Smiths and the shock this elicited from both the group and their fans. The recent US presidential election campaigns were unusual in a pop historical sense. Popular music and its live, high-profile exponents were largely absent. Apart from Trump's tone-deaf and bad dancing appropriation of village people and Lady Gaga's performance in support of Biden, there was little use of popular music and hence little related drama and intrigue in a semiotic sense. We didn't have the spectacular misappropriations of, say, George Bush Sr. and his glorious misreading of Springsteen's Born in the USA, or, on this side of the Atlantic, the equally cringeworthy sight of Thatcher's Tory government on victory in the general election, bellowing out John Lennon's Imagine to the party faithful without the merest hint of embarrassment. Beyond the political humour, the latter two examples are revealing. Both the Republicans and the Tories needed to commandeer the energy of the liberal left. It's a simple fact that high-profile musicians who come out to support political figures and party positions have overwhelmingly been on the side of the left and concerned with social justice. It's unlikely that the Lennon estate would have approved of the Tory appropriation of a celebrated utopian anthem. With this in mind, and given Northern Ireland's complex and controversial political history, it's hardly surprising that there's little to report on the state's commandeering of pop's left liberal cultural capital. But the more universal it seems the song's sentiments, the easier the appropriation. Two further examples come to mind. U2's performance of One at the Waterfront Hall, accompanied by the famous photograph of Bono with John Hume and David Trimble, just as the Good Friday Agreement is on the cusp of being brokered in 1998. And it's perhaps willful pastiche of Bob Marley with Michael Manley and Edward Sega at the One Love Peace concert in Jamaica in 1978. Also, we have national treasure Van Morrison's Days Like This and a number of his other songs from his back catalogue and their role as the soundtrack to the paramilitary ceasefire and its routinely broadcast accompanying public information film. We could devote an entire paper to these two incidents alone, whereby celebrity is recruited to the perceived good cause of peace and the related desire for things to be normal when they are patently anything but. But if music stars have overwhelmingly been on the side of the liberal left, one can countenance the historical difficulties the Northern Ireland state has faced. One cannot imagine hip stars, young or old, queuing up to support the objectively reactionary DUP in such a fashion. This would suggest that ours today is going to be a short paper. However, that's not the case. Popular music was very important to the Northern Ireland project. And in the 60s, under the premiership of Captain Terence O'Neill, especially in the early part of his tenure in office. In fact, it was vital.
The Labour election victory of 1964 is a pivotal moment. New Prime Minister Harold Wilson was putting pressure on Northern Ireland over two fundamental issues: social and political reform to end discrimination against the minority Catholic population and the region's poor economic performance. This was not business as usual. Whereas O'Neill's predecessor, Basil Brooke, could assume the subvention cheque was safely in the post, the new Labour administration wanted to see financial and social returns. Furthermore, Stormont could no longer depend on the deferential local newspapers and a seemingly disinterested UK press to keep loose talk about Northern Ireland at bay. The left of the Labour Party was agitating to put both the subvention and the convention into the media spotlight, believing them to be choking any possibility for progressive change. And to top it all, Wilson himself was ideologically in favour of Irish reunification. Needless to say, all this caused huge disquiet in unionist ranks. In order to achieve these goals, overturning a poor economic performance and pushing for reform to overturn discrimination in jobs and housing, the Northern Ireland state was in an invidious position. While both Stormont and Westminster have a history of uniting to actively conceal Northern Ireland's embarrassments to the UK's international reputation, the statelet was now under a new kind of political pressure. It not only had to come out of the shadows and overcome apparent media disinterest, but it also had to adopt a role that it was unaccustomed to, that is, presenting its best face to the world, announcing itself as open, inclusive, vibrant, youthful, and a dynamic region. After 4 decades of a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people being the acceptable state of affairs, it was no longer possible to simply close the curtains and hope nobody was watching.
Indeed, popular music was one of the means of achieving these goals, not of Stormont's own choosing, with pop pressed into the service of embodying the unquestioned goal for the future: success, vitality, normality. However, and importantly, in the period that marks the beginning of our focus, the early 1960s, there were no highly visible, credible, youthful acts famous for being from Northern Ireland. The success stories of the 50s, Ottilie Patterson and Ruby Murray, had largely receded from the limelight, and in pop terms, their celebrity, especially to the younger generation, seemed longer ago than it was. And none of these artists were explicitly linked to an Ulster project, new or otherwise. Northern Ireland was at relative peace, and as there was no conflict to respond to or document, the goal was putting Northern Ireland, in that now hackneyed phrase, on the map. Locally produced pop music could play a prominent role to help achieve the goals imposed on Stormont. It could greatly assist in putting Ulster positively on the map, both figuratively and literally. And because Northern Ireland was a relatively new addition to the map, it was clearly important to remind everyone that it was there, and of course, where its political loyalties lay.
Indeed, O'Neill's administration invested heavily in producing Ulster's official maps and ensuring that they were distributed widely to schools and other government buildings. As topographical propaganda, these maps were designed with a certain consistency, missing the Republic of Ireland, which had Atlantis-like seemingly disappeared into the sea, However, they made a feature of the North's close proximity to the United Kingdom. On the map is not and cannot be ideologically neutral. Rather, like the best of PR campaigns, it implants the idea the unquestioned goal should be to put this place on the map against its other, the assumed disinterest of the rest of the world. As John Hill notes in Cinema in Northern Ireland, the first scholarly account to deal with the state's propaganda newsreels, maps alongside images of Stormont regularly feature in a starring role. Maps displayed how Ulster Unionists desired the political geography of the statelet to be an integral part of the UK, yet somehow annexed from the rest of Ireland. However, against the seemingly common sense aim of celebrating Ulster achievement of a Protestant people defined by a work ethic, where industrialisation and scenic beauty are constantly stressed, what is of critical importance is the apparent disinterest that had been actively promoted by Westminster. The British state was less keen to put Northern Ireland on the map for fear it might draw attention to the poverty, civil rights abuses and gerrymandering that was going on. This rendered Northern Ireland, for central UK government, in the 50 years of the state's its formation, as a rather distinctive version of the archetype of the mad ant in the attic, a role that Northern Ireland has been forced to play in review show after review show for many years thereafter.
Okay, the other, sorry, is that me back in again?
Yep.
Forgive me, sorry. We've called this section of the presentation, even though this sexualization won't be too rigorous, Between Camps, in tribute to Paul Gilroy's fine monograph on the end of anti-racism. And we've deployed Gilroy's appropriation of Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of dialogism to extending it as a way of understanding how the Atlantic world was transmitting ideas back and forth in the domain of popular music and politics, whereby developments in pop in the US may have an effect on local political relations and, of course, vice versa. It's also rather cheekily indebted to an insight from countercultural musical philosopher Joni Mitchell and how the study of 1960s Northern Ireland has been a victim of what she calls a society of specialists. Indeed, the two most prominent surveys of the 1960s by Mark Mulholland and Simon Prince typify this position. There is a void when it comes to any investigation of the potential role of popular culture in this world of more orthodox and weighty political machinations. It's better known in such scholarly discourse that O'Neill preferred grand gestures, such as inviting Sean Lemass to Stormont in January '65, when many felt he should have been sitting down quietly having talks with nationalist representatives to flesh out reform. This much is widely known. What is much less countenance is the role popular music played in such grand overtures. And here we enter Northern Ireland's very own version of the appropriation of popular music to official political ends. If British politicians in the aftermath of World War II had been keen to distance themselves from the froth of popular culture, many historians of Northern Ireland in the 1960s and the following years have, for albeit different reasons, ran with the same kind of thinking and ignored the politics of popular musical representations and their role in the battle for hearts and minds at the time, no doubt assuming that it was at best of tangential relevance. If this is so with regard to the more front of house and visible politics of representation, it follows this is also the case when it comes to considering more foundational political economic connections between the music industry and the upper echelons of the Northern Ireland state. If scholarly political histories overlook popular music and its representational aspects, any possible quangos established between the state and local music business at the time are thoroughly marginal to the broader story.
The other main way in which the 1960s is remembered and curated is via the popular musical heritage industry, which plays a role in the construction and reproduction of popular memory. It's a role that Milan Kundera describes as the struggle of memory against forgetting. Central to the construction of popular memory in the decade is Them at the Maritime myth. This is offered up as the moment, according to the OES Centre, when Belfast, Northern Ireland, and by extension, the rest of the world, not only gets the blues, but becomes an island replete with popular music creativity and of the credible and original variety. It is also significant that the North is in the vanguard of this on-trend musical movement at this precise moment. Simply put, the story of them and the maritime dominates both insider and outsider perceptions of Northern Ireland in the decade. It's also interesting that the OES Centre draws sustenance not from local memory, but from the numerous pre-existing biographies of Van Morrison for its displays. The popular music narrative told through heritage initiatives forms a neat call and response to the more considered political historical narrative. In other words, as an example of Mitchell's Society of Specialists, it is silent about the intricacies of the informing contextual politics, as the political and historical narrative is with respect to popular music. To put it bluntly, the connection between state politics and popular music as a vital means of understanding 60s Northern Ireland has been conspicuously absent in two of the most prominent avenues for exploring the period.
But popular music is much more than a mere soundtrack to the era, or an important apolitical avenue to celebrate. If the heritage narrative avers that everyone was apparently having such a good time, much in line with the general image of the decade elsewhere, the scholarly histories, by contrast, have the virtue of calling out social and political injustices. But moving forward, such local heritage initiatives, with their connections to orthodox markers of success, and of course having to attract tourist revenues, serve to keep politics and its connections to music at bay, producing the impression that they have no relationship to each other whatsoever. Much less countenanced is whether the Northern Ireland state had designs for what locally produced popular music could do for it, whereby popular music, alongside industry, scenery, and sport, could play a vital role in promoting ideologies of normalisation, and hence downplaying systemic inequality and legislative and civic injustices. And as history attests, a good, well-manufactured myth will endure, with the PR narrative of them reproduced and repeated in online forums and blogs in the absence of any substantial supporting evidence or any semblance of a strong counter-narrative. If we begin with an example of this hidden pop politics relationship, as both Prince and Mulholland inform the reader, O'Neill, political differences notwithstanding, was a huge admirer of John F. Kennedy, his speeches, and his stagecraft. This admiration even stretched back to the period before Kennedy became America's youngest elected president, and O'Neill was Minister of Finance under the premiership Basil Brooke. This much is uncontroversial, a simple matter of extant scholarly record. However, what's missing is O'Neill's interest via Kennedy in popular music as a vehicle for political change.
1960 is a pivotal year in the broader story. In the presidential race, Kennedy commandeers Frank Sinatra's cross-media capital as an internationally successful crooner and major film star. Sinatra adapts his songs High Hopes in support of Kennedy. It's worth pausing to take this in. While pop and politics cozying up now is commonplace, in 1960 it was novel. This new US trend of popular music being pressed into servicing political needs was markedly different from the previous etiquette in British politics. The significant exception, of course, is the role of music and song in World War II. The United States also had its Jazz Ambassadors program. Beginning its first tour in 1956, the state-funded initiative hired leading musicians, notably Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, to counter Soviet propaganda, as Pravda was exposing the fact that the capitalist free world, as represented by its most powerful nation, was less than progressive when it came to racial politics and civil rights. As a globally orientated counter-propaganda operation, it was hugely successful. In explicitly deploying African-American music to promote multiculturalism, it acted as a pushback against the Soviet smears and the abject reality of segregation in the southern states. Perhaps one is already beginning to sense a parallel with what was happening in Northern Ireland.
Nonetheless, the Kennedy-Sinatra alliance is novel in another highly significant way. It was pointedly not in the national interest. Rather, its explicit goal was party political, placing a young Liberal Democrat senator and of Irish ancestry into the White House. In Britain, popular musical performers were not being placed in partisan positions. In the days before Oasis and Tony Blair, such a strategy was regarded as uncouth, a trivializing of the solemnity of politics proper, an affront to the dignity of the House and parliamentary procedure. The situation on this side of the Atlantic only changed in April 1964, as the leader of the opposition, Harold Wilson, appeared with the Beatles at the televised Royal Variety Club Awards. After all, Wilson was technically the Beatles' parliamentary representative, with his constituency of Houghton in Liverpool possessing one of the highest concentrations of people of Irish descent in England. Indeed, Wilson would often quip with friends in the Dáil that he had more Irish constituents than many Dublin politicians. But the Beatles at the event were in no way sycophantic. They were joining in with Harold on their own terms. It was, as you might imagine, much talked about at the time in all varieties of domestic living rooms and in the more bespoke wood-panelled settings politicians were accustomed to.
Earlier that year, the Beatles had achieved the seemingly impossible. They broke into the American music market, successfully invading the US and kickstarting the so-called British invasion. On top of striking this new, if unexpected, oil reserve, the Beatles also afforded a desirable representational qualities for this equally new Labour-led Britain. These were specific to popular music as a form at that time: regional dynamism, democratisation, as the group were overwhelmingly working class with a do-it-yourself ethic, such as writing their own songs, which was unusual, and a general sense of breaking with the outdated rules of the old guard. As Nick Cohen put it on witnessing the group breaking America, they had no lead singer, no orthodox focal point, and hence broke with the reigning template of singer plus backing band, as with, say, Cliff Richard and the Shadows. Against custom and practice, the Beatles, importantly, were a collective. Of course, we know the outcome via endless documentaries about popular music in the 1960s. The group had a huge influence over the culture of the decade. Less focused on, though, is that the Beatles' endorsement of Labour and Wilson played a not insubstantial role in putting the party in power and ending 13 years of Tory rule. The fact that popular music occupied something of this role has received some attention in political studies of British popular culture. The same, however, cannot be said about analysis of the UK's most contrary region, to borrow Rex Cathcart's famous phrase. While it's well known in more specifically political histories that O'Neill pilfered Northern Ireland Labour Party's technocratic modernising clothes, to borrow Mulholland's memorable phrase, even purloining its new Ulster epithet, it is much less of a feature of such discourse that O'Neill might have been engaging in other acts of appropriation. He commandeered via Kennedy's legacy some of Wilson's popular music capital and assumed some of the collective orientation of the Beatles' semiotic. It might come as a surprise, but O'Neill was publicly name-checking the Beatles well in advance of Wilson, let alone Labour, forming a government. If Wilson had to wait and see whether the Beatles would break America and to assess whether this would be a sustained and not merely a pop novelty, O'Neill was already referencing the Beatles in speeches, and these were featured heavily in the media at the time. The first was, the headline read, "Premier has scrap and build plan for Ulster." This appeared in late 1963, and while Beatlemania was an embedded concept at this point, the group had yet to become an international phenomenon, marked by their first US #1 and their arrival in the States in February 1964. At this point, when it came to mixing pop and politics, the normally reserved O'Neill was for once in the avant-garde.
2 points of interest emerge here. First, in the days before New Labour's Alistair Campbell, that notorious pop culture savvy spin doctor, O'Neill was remarkably well informed about these not yet fully consolidated popular musical trends and their political possibilities. An odd aspect, I think, heightened by his Gladstone-like demeanour. Second, O'Neill was reliant on a Campbell-like figure. Who within Ulster Unionism was advising him? I mean, if one was to work their way through O'Neill's cabinet, there's hardly an obvious candidate for the Campbell position. I mean, Billy Craig, anyone? I mean, whichever way, this too conceals a serious point, and another problem O'Neill was open about facing, the renewal of the Unionist Party. So O'Neill starts to reference the Beatles with increasing regularity in media prominence, and this name dropping, I think, has two immediate functions, therefore, in the context of the turn of 63 into 64. The first is the problem of modernising the Unionist Party and overcoming the fact that its young members, going against the thrust of the 1960s, were old in outlook and attitude, and to, as importantly, attracting young Catholics into support for the Union. Before being goaded by Westminster after Labour took office, O'Neill was aware that Kennedy was agitating for change in Northern Ireland, and that this momentum would continue after Kennedy's death. And even if the border and sovereignty were not yet explicitly on the agenda, there was new pressure to overturn Northern Ireland's reputation with respect to those two fundamental planks, social reform and poor economic performance. The challenge, and hence the name dropping of the Beatles, was how to bring an insular, defensive and isolationist party with an old guard and attitude that was young in age into the cultural sphere and the related values, the youthful modernity which the new beat music embodied. Whatever the answers to these pressing questions, O'Neill needed something similar, just as the US needed its jazz ambassadors to hammer home a message of inclusivity and normality in the face of their objective absence. Looked at from the reverse perspective, O'Neill didn't have many other options when it came to fulfilling these grand gestures. Just as Kennedy made connections with pop stars and their representatives, so did O'Neill. But O'Neill faced a number of problems. First, Northern Ireland and Westminster liked to keep the affairs of the region under tight control as far as the media was concerned.
And while Northern Ireland was at relative peace throughout most of the 1960s, the early 60s anyway, O'Neill had to make a major adjustment, taking the province out of the shadows to face the realpolitik of the new consumer-driven world. Cabinet minutes of the period convey the sense of jeopardy here. The statelet had to move from isolationist, even paranoid mentality, whereby it was rigorously tracking what was being said about it by other nations, into planting positive stories about the economic gains it was making in order to support its technocratic mandate and, importantly, attract inward investment from the US. However, foundational reform carried a greater risk than attracting inward investment. It would be construed as appeasing Catholics and thus would render O'Neill unpopular with the Unionist rank and file. But moreover, inward investment from America was important for reasons beyond mere money. In the face of the demise of traditional industries, the American companies could be trusted to overturn the latter's legacy of partisan employment practices, giving O'Neill a necessary shield, or so he thought. To add to O'Neill's not inconsiderable problems, he also had to contend with a new, much less welcome fount of power from the US, the incredibly well-funded and PR-savvy world of the evangelical right, and its desire to circumvent the ideals for which the decade is most associated. This took on an odd but powerfully felt local inflection of the American-led style in the hulking form of Ian Paisley, a figure who had little appetite for long hair, beat music, and the ideals for which the decade is celebrated by libertarians.
Nevertheless, if popular music could offer good news, the first sense of a practical problem Stormont faced was the absence of a local group who could act as an example of the Beatles' energy and join in with the export success of the British invasion movement, and hence tick the vital boxes of international entrepreneurial achievement and suitably positive PR. Clearly, O'Neill couldn't go to the Beatles themselves. The group would have every reason to give Ulster Unionism, in any of its guises, a wide berth. This is especially so given that 3/4 of the collective are of Irish ancestry, And as later events would go on to prove, they took more than a passing interest in Irish affairs, even daring in song to take sides in the argument. Second, the group was aligned with Labour. And even if O'Neill had appropriated local Labour's plans, in Simon Prince's words, to make that party redundant, British beat groups were unlikely recruits to O'Neill's version of a good cause. But O'Neill wasn't finished with trying to pilfer from Labour, except this time he would be appropriating from its less formalised popular musical wing. Nonetheless, there were still obstacles to overcome. While O'Neill needed a local beat group to spread his good news at home and abroad, to convey this necessary sense of regional dynamism, the not insubstantial problem was the absence of just such a contender. He already had with George Best working class Protestant achievement in sport and football, and one moreover that didn't simply represent joining in, but rather had the capacity to surprise and to bedazzle the metropolitan centre. But the same did not exist in popular musical terms in 1963 and all of 64. While pop had the advantage over football of penetrating the American market and spreading Northern Ireland's good news to its major projected source for inward investment, there were no examples of Belfast beat and R&B groups that had broken out as success stories beyond the region. Show bands wouldn't have fitted the bill, as these were perceived as old-fashioned, uncool, behind the fashion curve.
But O'Neill's Kennedy-inspired mission would continue apace. Against the tide of expectation, he managed to second the Beatles themselves. But before one gets too excited, what was secured was not actually the group, but the right to use their image. In a not widely remembered PR coup, Stormont managed to overcome the conundrum of the traditional and the modern. The Beatles' image was emblazoned on a special series of Ulster linen tea towels, which Noel will now hold up, my beautiful assistant, will now display that they do actually exist. We managed to track one down. Beyond using a pop twist to support an alien Protestant-dominated industry, this licensing link-up begins to reveal the presence of a hidden hand. O'Neill is being advised. And while the Fab Four's Ulster linen tea towels would become the export sensation of the first half of 1964, with their PR pumped press appearances rigorously tracked by the state in overseas territories, it would be a mistake to assume this revealed the one-party state's newfound love of beat music. So who devised the strategy and helped them secure the rights to pop royalty? The hidden figure, or perhaps figures here, are the Solomon family, particularly younger son Phil Solomon. Now, while Northern Ireland has a history of music industry movers and shakers, these and others are literally dwarfed by the power and influence of what we refer to in our book as Solomon Incorporated. The Belfast-born and based Solomon family at the time were the majority shareholders in Decca Records, the major on-trend R&B label. The Stones were licensed to Decca, and the label was also the major distributor of American R&B, giving them a certain cachet with the young who were into these new, cool sounds.
Indeed, Phil Solomon was objectively more powerful than even Brian Epstein or Andrew Lowe Oldham, the young personality managers who feature in a high-profile way in retrospectives of the Beatles and the Stones. As Michael Murphy explains in his analysis of the Irish music business, the Solomons were the major in and out point between Ireland and the international market. The family was Decca's exclusive distributors for the Irish market, however insignificant this is as a consumer territory, and more importantly, the major harvesters of Irish talent for ascension to the international sphere. A long deployed strategy was test driving artists in the local context before attempting their crossover. Phil Solomon had sensational chart success before the mid-60s. He managed Ruby Murray, who still holds the record for the most songs in the UK charts at a given point. He also managed the Bachelors, the proto-Irish boy band who outsold even the Beatles in 1963, as well as briefly representing Tom Jones, even bequeathing the singer his stage name. In addition to major investment in many aspects of Northern Ireland's popular music infrastructure, from instruments and amplification to hi-fis and radios, to hire purchase through studio recording, Phil Solomon also had related interests in film and television production and an extensive repertoire of promoting live appearances by international artists in Ireland. Crucially, the Solomon family were part of a small Jewish community in Northern Ireland, and this is not a mere fact of ethnicity. Rather, it provided a vital outsider status in regard to the either-or of the usual tribal allegiances. The most prominent index of this is Phil's brother Mervyn's local record label, Emerald. With hindsight, Emerald had scant regard for local enmities, and as a result, it doubtfully could function in today's more label-savvy climate. It would be boycotted by virtually every record buyer, as the label had a roster that covered the gamut from Kick the Poke bands to performers of Irish rebel songs.
Nonetheless, if O'Neill needed an advisor who could design and realise the ambitions of putting Northern Ireland on the map, the internationally connected and exceedingly powerful Solomons were the only people capable of executing such a grand plan and to such a rapid timetable. If tempted by the star-spangled pop political propaganda exercise, the naturally conservative Stormont would need to step very carefully into this potentially volatile yet effective exercise. The scent of the 1963 Profumo affair still lingered in the air as a warning of what could happen when pop and politics got too close. Solomon had every good reason to support the one-party state. He realised that Paisley was bad for business in general and for the music business in particular. O'Neill was also canny enough to think on the basis, Marxist fashion, of what his real needs were. Paisley wanted to shut down what the increasingly secular young wanted to be and do. And in fact, this greatly added to pop's appeal when it came to solving real political problems. The first giveaway sign of Solomon involvement in Brand MI and O'Neill's campaign is in the legendary campaign to promote them and Van Morrison at the Maritime in April 1964. Solomon would eventually and openly manage the group, but both he and the family were likely heavily involved in the affairs of the band long before this point. However, what is important here to note is the fly posting campaign for the Maritime debut, an aspect of the story significantly missing from all of the official accounts, the Morrison biographies, and even the heritage material, but which is to the forefront of the vernacular memory of the scenesters at the time. The flyers were printed on brightly hued paper and simply stated, "Them are coming." Novel, inspirational, an example of the cleverness of local PR, perhaps.
However, it's factually more interesting that this imaginative local PR assault was less local ingenuity than a direct pastiche of the Beatles' campaign to break into the US in January 1964. I think Joanna's going to show the image for us then as well. And the link person here is Les Perrin, a ghostly figure known to insiders at the time as press agent to the Stars, and oft regarded by modern exponents of the form as the founding father of modern pop PR. As a gun for hire, Perrin worked variously for the Beatles and EMI, Rolling Stones, and very regularly for Decca and Philip Solomon. It points back here to the linen tea towels and the complex machinations involved in securing the group's image for Ulster PLC. If only Perrin and Solomon had done the same thing for the Stones and Northern Ireland PLC, I mean, this would add more evidence, but my goodness, it's highly unlikely. But then, of course, history is stranger than reality. History is stranger than its interpretation or discourse in some ways. There you go. The Stones, they cashed in yet again. The Stones and Ulster PLC representation of this begs very interesting issues. But there is further, more strictly local evidence of the quango. The local press, even the newsletter, begins to include standalone features and in advance of them at the Maritime, promoting the idea of the new music as a viable industry and the fact that it needs investment in order to succeed, with Solomon insiders heralded as the go-to experts who can fix any apparent problems. Thus, Phil Solomon had two imperatives. The first is better known, finding a group, them to be as Northern Ireland Rolling Stones. But this in itself doesn't even make immediate sense. There already is a Rolling Stones, and their license to the label Solomon has the controlling share in. In other words, he's set to profit from the already existing group. Also, pop history, the regional beat and R&B market is already oversaturated by the time he officially begins to manage them in mid-64. Indeed, over that summer, the Beatles, Animals, and the Kinks occupied the #1 slot, while them are in the recording studio and haven't released a record. It suggests a bigger game was afoot, but such a local beat or R&B group would have to bring something to the table. What is it? Is it to go deeper into the form as George Best went deeper into football? Second, any success for Solomon and O'Neill is not reducible to the group themselves. Instead, as with Epstein, it's about sustainability. And if the Beatles become synonymous with not only kickstarting the impossible, the British invasion movement, they're also noteworthy for consolidating a distinctive Mersey sound, an early example of putting the region on the map.
In addition, a youth magazine called City Week appeared in November 1964, also new were its City Beat pages covering beat and R&B and show bands. However, the timing of its arrival is really interesting. Local newspapers at the time were in a degree of financial trouble, evidenced by the closure of the Northern Wing, whereas this novel youth paper rather ostentatiously flaunted large sections in full colour. It reveals a certain confidence and even possibly subsidisation. Importantly, the magazine was launched within a matter of days of the release of Baby Please Don't Go, them's first hit. This coincidence, or series of coincidences, is not exhausted yet. In January 1965, just as them entered the top 40, John True, the magazine's editor, made the links that we've been excavating explicit. And think of the keywords and phrases such as on the map, new vitality, new Ulster, and of course pilfering from the Northern Ireland Labour Party. John True said the following in an editorial: "Whatever you may think of their music, you have to give credit to local group Them for putting Belfast on the pop map. With their record climbing the charts, the Belfast boys with the scruffy look may well have started a new Ulster industry, pop music for export. They might not represent the new image of Ulster that Premier O'Neill talks about, but they are succeeding in what is the most competitive fields of big business. All the signs suggest that this local brand of music could really knock Mersey Beat off its pedestal. This is not just of interest to teenagers, it could also make a big contribution to the prosperity of the whole province."
Still stuns me when I hear that one, but evidently this magazine was no left field publication. I mean, hardly an International Times. Conversely, it was published by the Morton Group, responsible for what we might call the ever reliable newsletter. Not unsurprisingly, given the novel success of Them, it would not only narrate the story of the group in an ongoing soap opera through 1965, City Week would publish editorials and features supporting O'Neill. After Them's success in early 65, it would report also on the problems of an apparent talent drain. Timeline is vital in uncovering the connections between the showman and the politician, just as timing was vital for the O'Neill-Solomon quango in the 60s. First, the legendary Maritime Night of the 17th of April, 1964, exactly coincides with the announcement of the Stones' debut concert in Belfast and tickets going on sale. Second, the appearance of legendary Stones A&R Dick Rowe at the Maritime with the supposed goal of signing a group when the deal was already done synchronizes directly with the release of the Stones' highly anticipated first LP. This is especially important as it links the two groups in the local imagination. Third, Them coincidentally entered the charts with their first hit single, As Lamass is Visiting Stormont. And fourthly, the hit singles run as the theme song for Ready, Steady, Go runs in parallel with the most high-profile series of Ulster Week trade fairs on London's Oxford Street. The most revealing aspect of the O'Neill-Solomon relationship and its mutual interest is in the following. This is when and where it becomes overt visual evidence of a careful but intensive campaign to link the new music to brand Northern Ireland and its not yet legendary rhythm and blues group. Joanna's again going to show the image, and I'll talk over the top of it, if I may.
Sorry, can you see that, Joe?
Not as yet, Joe, no. Fantastic, thank you. Okay, this image of them, taken from the cover of their single, standing outside the gates of Stormont, is rather complex. I mean, firstly, one can read it as a jokey affront to the state and to the world of politics in a kind of general way. Secondly, but more importantly, this reading is actually what's desired. The image is putting Northern Ireland again on the map, while also signalling that the province is brimming with the same type of youthful energy and critical questioning of other regions in the United Kingdom. Despite its ambiguity, it is significant that this image again isn't featured or let alone critically explored in heritage discourse. Whether it's an endorsement or a parody of the one-party regime, in fact, cleverly, it's both, it still succeeds in putting Northern Ireland and that goal on the map. One could imagine the debate between the politician and the showman at this point, and of how the former would need to be convinced of its appropriateness in solving his political problems. But if it helps, the Stones deployed a similar image via Perrin on the Mall with Buckingham Palace in the Stormont role. Whichever way, special permission would have to be granted to take such a picture. Against what the image works hard to convey, it is certainly not a fun, impromptu photo captured spontaneously on the hoof. While scruffy long hairs seem very far from O'Neill's new Ulster, as True records, as the image attests, surface appearances can indeed be deceptive.
Phil Solomon's vertical and horizontal showbiz influences are best evidenced by the 3 appearances by the Rolling Stones in Northern Ireland over an 18-month period. Their Belfast debut concert took place in July 1964, with, of course, the expected attendant mayhem. Their last gig ever, because they never played in the city or, in fact, Northern Ireland again, was an equally riotous affair in September 1965. However, the trouble created by their final Belfast engagement was not to be simply contained by lines of RUC officers holding back screaming, fainting teenagers. That's because the Stones arrived in Ireland in late '65, accompanied by a vehemently anti-capitalist and anti-racist countercultural director called Peter Whitehead, who had been tasked by their management to make a film about the band's trip. At the outset, this probably seemed like an on-trend and fun idea that would literally project to the rest of the world the Stones enjoying a bucolic Ireland and interacting with normal, dynamic youth excited to be part of the capitalist aspirational drive. One of the most popular bands on the planet, skipping through a groovy technocratic New Ulster, seemed exactly the sort of thing O'Neill would need via Solomon as an advanced global PR strategy. However, Whitehead had his very own particular agenda, and the film that he made, entitled Charlie Is My Darling, is lightning in a bottle politically. Whitehead was known for his laser-like journalistic eye and his ability to embed and encode latent symbols and esoteric messages into his work. He was a true maverick, and his allegiance was always to the truth of any situation as he saw it. When the opportunity presented itself to film in Ireland, this highly complex and politicised director seized it to enter Trojan horse-like as merely a pop film director. Whitehead enigmatically noted at the time that people would see what they wanted to see in the film.
Well, everybody else might have believed Whitehead was creating a jolly little travelogue with Ireland as the backdrop for Jagger and Co.'s youthful japes. The director had ambitions to expose the tensions and civil unrest being fanned by Paisley, reference the Dungannon housing protests for civil rights, and also expose Paisley as the increasingly popular frontman for good old-fashioned sectarianism. The charismatic reverend did not reserve his Old Testament criticism for the Catholic Church. He was also firmly against any kind of ecumenicism, globalism, or social reform, and of course ungodly activities like pop music and dancing. Exactly the activities the Stones, Whitehead, Solomon, the local youth of the day, and even O'Neill to a certain extent wanted and needed. Whitehead firmly laid down the Holy War's gauntlet in the film by placing a young Church of Ireland minister named Donor McNeice in full clerical garb front and centre at the Belfast Stones concert. His prominent presence in the film at first seems incongruous and playing to the stereotype of a disapproving church representative in the midst of hedonistic pandemonium. However, a follow-up interview, which was strategically placed on the cover of the next edition of City Week, revealed McNeice's appreciation for the Stones and his enthusiasm for the music. Was, after all, a recently retired radio DJ. The message is clear to more conservative Ulster youth. Regardless of their religious designation, rhythm and blues may sound like the devil's music, but it's a godlier option than Paisley's alternative because you can still have fun. One would imagine such a concept would have delivered a positive PR boost to O'Neill and Solomon's campaign to promote this swinging new Ulster. Perhaps either misjudging or rather completely understanding all the sensitivities involved, Whitehead also included in his film an opening sequence from Map Ireland Without a Border, images of poverty, the lack of modernity, sections shot separately in Dublin and Belfast, intercut as they were the same city, and including with the Stones reading a copy of Life magazine detailing the LA Watts civil rights uprising, clearly linking it to what was happening in Northern Ireland at the time. And it's worth remembering that Whitehead was doing this in the context of the British press never reporting on the long-standing civil rights abuses in Northern Ireland and the growing tensions in the streets as a result. Due to the convention, such affairs, of course, had been ignored in parliamentary debate attendant media reportage.
Add to this potent mix O'Neill's paranoia about bad PR and also the amount of time, effort and money he was spending to project a completely different image with his new Ulster project. And we might have an explanation as to why, within weeks of the film being finished and screened just once at a European festival, Charlie Is My Darling effectively disappeared from public view for just over 50 years. Obviously, O'Neill had got his fingers burnt by the unpredictable pop lightning at the time, and then he must have realised the situation in Northern Ireland was rapidly sliding out of his control. At this point, not even the Beatles could help him. With recourse to timelines, one gets the sense this is when Solomon and O'Neill's informal mutual support network became strained, as the tentatively balanced edifice of Belfast blues scene for export effectively fell to pieces. After Solomon's petulant withdrawal from the local scene, there would be no more UK or Irish hits for them, nor any other Northern Ireland group or singer for the rest of the decade. The relationship of convenience was further tested to breaking point when O'Neill failed to come to Solomon's aid in the pirate radio battles raging in the seas between Britain and Ireland in 66 and 67. Despite delivering exactly what O'Neill had wanted and needed, i.e. a thriving local music and recording industry, a nationally successful on-trend youth band, the most popular artists playing in Northern Ireland, easy access to modern domestic entertainment and communications tech, and support for a vibrant youth magazine, Solomon must have felt the sense of betrayal when the captain did not back his attempt to keep Radio Caroline on air when the government announced it was actively shutting it down. The incredibly popular pirate radio station was an effective tool for influencing trends and sales, and it was a serious cash cow for Solomon since he'd bought it over for a princely sum in 1964.
One gets a sense of Solomon's frustrations through his public parting shots squarely aimed at a floundering O'Neill and his empty grand gesture politics. For a man who spent a lifetime, Wizard of Oz fashion, carefully secreted behind the curtain pulling the levers, Solomon opted instead for a full-on volley from the good ship Radio Caroline, scant regard for civilian casualties. As a sign of his confidence, Solomon tore up his British citizenship and obtained an Irish passport, believing himself exempt from the British Marine Broadcasting Act. He then began a mutually beneficial relationship with the upper echelons of the Irish state, even admitting years later that he bribed Finance Minister Charles Haughey in an attempt to keep Caroline afloat. Next, he announced in Billboard magazine that a new high-power transmitter on the pirates' northern ship would cover all Ireland, making Solomon a piratical version of the BBC's Lord Reith, replete with a cutlass and an eye patch. He was realising, at least via the airwaves, Peter Whitehead's vision of Ireland with the Rolling Stones without a border. But perhaps the least deserving casualty in this pop political feud is the sadly neglected East Belfast-born David McWilliams, who Solomon managed in 1967. I mean, this talented singer-songwriter is often misconstrued in heritage discourse as Solomon's Bob Dylan, but examinations of the details of his lyrics reveal him to be so much more. As a critical commentator on Northern Ireland affairs, McWilliams is the missing link on Emerald Records' pan-sectarian portfolio until his services were required by disgruntled Philip Solomon to take potshots at Ulster's social and economic catastrophes. In his enthusiasm to lambast O'Neill's artifice of normality, Solomon literally killed McWilliams' career with overhype, spending disproportionately on his promotion in Britain. The singer's association with the antagonistic pirate radio king also meant he was effectively banned from the new Radio 1's playlists. Solomon was too powerful. By way of conclusion then, official politics and pop had to be kept apart, or at the very least, set in presumed opposition to one another, with kids having to appear not to give a damn about it. If the residue of Profumo still lingered, the generation gap and ideologies of rock authenticity would add to the chorus of why the politician and the showman could never be seen together. Ironically, the presence of Solomon, an established legend of Irish showbiz, as he was described by Johnny Rogan, and from an older habitus than the groups, would not have assisted at this point. Nonetheless, the Quango, despite the parting of ways, more than fulfilled its brief. Popular music now plays a vital part in the dominating popular memory of the 1960s, whispering loudly to us about what could have been. It creates the perhaps false impression that all O'Neill needed was more time. This is a highly political overture. It suggests, as a related absent presence, that those campaigning to overturn foundational injustices were part of the problem and not part of the solution. And as Edward Said reminds us, the problems born of the residue of imperialism rarely simply go away by themselves or simply through progress. Central to the project of popular musical normalization is control of the narrative, the organization and the production of public memory, how the notional past is remembered in the present, whereby myths, which are actively produced, are most successful when they erase this manufacture and are duly awarded with becoming the common sense wisdom on the subject of Northern Ireland's rhythm and blues ambassadors. But with further irony, the state eventually got what it needed in Astral Weeks, except by this time, it's too late. The new Ulster project was over. The troubles had begun. But Astral Weeks' status as both Northern Ireland high and folk culture is secure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Noel and Joanna, thank you so much for that wonderful kind of introduction to the themes which you explore in greater length in the book, How Belfast Got the Blues. Let's open it up to questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question to Noel and Joanna, can you just indicate you want to do that by pressing the little icon with a hand or a hand and a combined smiley face at the top of your screen, and then unmute yourself and I'll invite you to speak. Okay. Who'd like to start? Guy?
I enjoyed that a lot. For many reasons. It was also an interesting duet between the two of you. It was quite a harmony. But I am puzzled by something here a bit. I mean, it's very compelling, right? I mean, it gives us the whole prehistory, like you say, to Astral Weeks, which is fantastic. But I'm wondering to how much are you letting yourself push this? You're presenting a thesis here, which is perhaps pushed a bit to an extreme. I don't want to sound negative here, so I'm raising it as a question, so you can challenge yourselves. But this notion, I'm not too convinced by this notion of this O'Neill-Solomon quango, right? I mean, we have here a whole plan. You first of all start off with the theory itself, saying, you know, this was missing. We have this notion. It's happening in the States with JFK Sinatra. It's happening with Labour in Britain. Wilson, the Beatles, and now it was just missing in Northern Ireland. So now we have to just fit the piece together. We already know where it's going. We just need them to match the two together. And then it all falls into place very nicely after that. And of course, it all seems that it works that way because, like you say, there's the heritage industry at the end of the line, which will turn it into a narrative, right? But there's something as an historian, I mean, these are things which trouble me all the time methodologically. You know, how much are we creating ourselves an interpretive narrative here, which needs to be thought about? How much are we jumping towards the conclusion where Solomon has his own interests completely along the whole way? I find it problematic with statements like saying, you know, after he did all of this, and you can label them very, very clearly, it's very sharply analyzed, he must have felt betrayed by that. Why must he have felt betrayed? I mean, you don't see his papers there. You kind of read it into certain reactions and other things. The Radio Caroline, and I don't know much about these things. It's a much larger issue within kind of, you know, Britain than just this specific issue. And you're right. I mean, there's interesting things here showing the Stormont gates in the PR photo. And of course, that needed permission, right? Because you can't do something like that in Northern Ireland without permission. On the other hand, I'm thinking all the time about, if you want to talk about memory and popular memory, how many people, what did they read into it? What do we know that people read out of that picture? How many of the people actually identified that it's Stormont Gates and had interpretations of it? I mean, that would make it more interesting for me if we follow the picture beyond the projection into the reception.
Okay, thank you, Guy. You've actually described very eloquently what we thought all along while writing the book over the last 5 years. And you also raised the issue of the formal problem of doing a presentation, because in one way you have to give a snapshot, because the other way of doing this is that you create something that looks like a legal document. And there's no way in which we're going to be able to wheel in every small bit of evidence to an hour-long presentation. I mean, I don't want to do the book plug bit here, but if you're interested in reading further about how we assemble the correspondences, I mean, there's a point where we faced our own O'Neill-like crossroads. There's a moment where you go, right, this is going to defeat us in terms of ultimate evidence. Or you go the other way and you think, right, we tried to keep going away from the Solomon O'Neill quango as researchers. We thought, right, and the evidence kept pulling us back like an elastic band. I mean, I could go into the minutiae of 101 other micro correspondences, but you raise, I think, something that's very interesting and very topical right now, which is how do you begin to engage with the machinations of power when power, and I don't think this is controversial, power, when it is in a controversial situation, is very, very good at erasing its traces. I remember that Joanna and I sitting with one of the greats of Irish film studies and greats of British film studies internationally. We sat with him in a Belfast hotel and we talked through all this. He'd read some of our work at a midpoint and we were talking it over, and he said, look, when it's, you know, with these things, you just wish you could find the affidavit, don't you? You could find the minuted meeting between Solomon and O'Neill. I mean, probably one of the most compelling bits of evidence is the manner in which O'Neill offered quite strong political support for the small Jewish community in Northern Ireland, but he kept that out of the spotlight because Paisley was having, I think, not so thinly veiled semi-anti-Semitic shots at the Jewish community that were beginning to join in with unionist politics. I mean, there's umpteen correspondences that start from 63 onwards, and there are umpteen correspondences in terms of where Solomon starts to work with the state. I mean, it was one of the things that we angsted about with the paper is that, you know, you want to give a cogent thesis, yet at the same time, a cogent thesis can make something that's a lot more nuanced sound quite mechanical. You know, and it's not like as if they're sitting down going, hey, Phil, could you make this happen right now? Yeah, good on, Terence. We've got the mutual interest here, man. Let's go. It's the relationship is much more convoluted. I mean, the real shocker for us was that this vital period that includes the role. I mean, is Solomon involved in the Rolling Stones affairs? Is Dick Rowe effectively his employee? Can he move this? Is he more senior even in the Stones affairs than Andrew Lowe Oldham? Yes, fact. Why have you the Stones in the city for three occasions, making great PR capital, and then it just vanishes? I mean, I think that the evidence is there, and this is crucial. Film studies evidence. The evidence is in the film as the text, and the text begins to reveal Peter Whitehead, true to his maverick form throughout the 60s, doing something that O'Neill could not countenance, and doing something that Solomon, I don't think, would wholly approved of. Like Solomon's first loyalty, in one sense, was to business and to creating a vibrant Northern Ireland. They shared that goal. They shared that goal and they pushed together to realize that goal. But all the cabinet for press, publicity and propaganda papers for that vital period, that includes, among other things, the riots in the Divis Street, the Dagannon housing protest, the start of the civil rights movement in the 60s, and the Stones 3 visits and anything about the Quango, the minutes for the cabinet of publicity, press and propaganda are missing from mid-1963 all the way through to the end of 1965. That's an objective fact. What is in that documentation? Now, we've raised this with Peroni again and again and again and again. Freudian slip there calling Peroni the beer. That says something, I think. There. Let's not analyze that. But I mean, you face a dilemma. You leave it in the absence of the ultimate affidavit, or you start to try and assemble everything you can across discourse, representation, minuted meetings, timelines, correspondences to make as compelling a case as you can. I hope, Guy, if you have the time and the enthusiasm to read the book, I hope you find that the book, you know, we get very evidential in the 4th chapter to try and really intricately pull all of these things together. I mean, I don't know whether I was mad before or I've gone mad since, but I think I came out of writing that 4th chapter and doing the timeline research for a different individual than the one that went in, a bit like the way we all might be different when we come out of lockdown, you know, than the people we were when we went in. But
I also too as well, I think it's worth, you know, in terms of what we could find with solid evidence. As an investigative journalist, it's always follow the money. And when we got what was actually left in the vestiges of the press and propaganda papers was the budget for 64, 65 for publicity. And from basically there on in, it quadrupled. The budget for publicity for Northern Ireland effectively quadrupled from 63 into 64. And Noel, you know, not to kind of add a level of intrigue to it, but not only are the papers missing, but they were dummied up to make it look like they were still there, because we had to seek special permission to get them. and we had a long wait for them to be retrieved from the archive. And we were quite excited. We turned up at Prony in our kind of Sunday best in anticipation of getting these, because this was the smoking gun. You know, we were getting rubbing our hands in glee, waiting to get this. And the librarian in Prony was delighted for us. He was so excited about us getting the files. And he handed us over 2 big, chunky, exciting looking files, and we retreated off to the desk. And then we opened the files and had that moment of, I've seen this before. This is not 64, 65, 66. This is 63, photocopied 5 times and put into the folder to make it look like it had the same bulk as the other. And this is a key moment in Northern Ireland's history. The documentation is gone. We went back and we asked Prony. According to them, the files had never been out. They'd never been taken out by anybody else. They'd been set on their shelves from they were deposited. And yet when we got the documentation and opened it, it had been dummied up by somebody else. Now, I also worked in politics for 5 years, as my esteemed colleague at Stormont will tell you, John Barry will tell you. And, you know, there's something very fishy about the fact that that material is gone. I think it's also really important to point out as well, Phil Solomon was not a man who ever attracted or wanted personal publicity. In fact, nobody's written the biography of him. You know, nobody has ever written it because the material doesn't exist. For him to actually step out of the shadows and go to the newspapers to effectively tear up his British citizenship and just basically say Ireland was a much more liberal place that was encouraging, you know, new industry and music, that was exceptionally unusual for him to break cover. And there was no other reason for doing it than to deliver a slap in the face to O'Neill at the Radio Caroline, because he never did it before. He didn't put out personal press releases about himself. He was too rich and too powerful. I mean, Noel and I were even shocked at the levels of power and influence that Solomon had. You know, with the Brit, you could effectively have kind of marked him as probably one of the most successful businessmen per se in Northern Ireland of the period. Because, you know, the stuff that we've read about them, the influence that they had in terms with Decca and with a number of other companies and holdings that they had, the transatlantic relationships that they had with the American music industry, they were literally the only people in Ireland who had this. It was exclusive to them. To be actually, if O'Neill wanted to use popular music, the only people he could go to in Northern Ireland were the Solomons. It's as simple as that. There's nobody else.
If we stay with this theme of timing for a bit here, and I mean, guys, it's a brilliant question, and I hope everybody else doesn't mind us staying with it. But Peter Whitehead and the Stones are kind of like the linchpin, but also Solomon's ability to maneuver, like payola, his ability to kind of to exercise payola to buy music into the charts is legendary. What becomes interesting is they released Baby Please Don't Go on the beginning of November 64, and it stiffs. Now, at first we thought, God, that's unlike Solomon to pardon the technical term, to fuck it up. I mean, so why is it stiff? Then the next part of the timeline is he buys them onto an R&B heavy legendary episode of Ready Steady Go, where they're on the bill with the Stones and Jerry Lee Lewis, and it's a landmark moment in R&B coming to the fore. Yet them, without a chart hit, are in this legendary assembled company. And even with that appearance, which you can watch on YouTube, it still stiffs. Now, what Solomon does very cleverly, he writes the script for the presenter to introduce the band from Belfast that echoes the wording of the Them at the Maritime campaign, which places them in Belfast and announces their Northern Irishness on this very R&B heavy episode. And then he also includes a young Afro-Caribbean woman who is the only person who occupies the frame by herself alongside Morrison in the montage, that is sending the very clear signal. This is a kind of an anti-segregationist, funky, forward-looking kind of Northern Ireland. But the single still stiffs. And then the single, very conveniently, enters the charts 3 months after its release. 3 months at the time then when Lamass, the major piece of PR for the technocratic Ulster, where the biggest chess move to make nationalists, to invite nationalists to see the state as something legitimate. And those things correspond, and that's just one little set of correspondences among a wall of which I could go on and on and on in this vein passionately about this, because there's a point where the correspondences just go, not again, surely not the same day.
Even we were thinking that, even we were going, look, it can't be Solomon again, but then we went in, it's back to Solomon, all roads.
Can I just come in? Sorry, Noel. So just see if anyone else wants to ask any questions. Sorry to interrupt there. But do you have anyone else keen to ask? Just flag yourselves up.
Kevin Rogers, yeah.
Okay, Kevin, and then Keith. Kevin first. You need to unmute yourself, Kevin.
Yeah, my dad had come from North Ireland and Belfast. His favourite musician was Van Morrison. Van Morrison, like Van Morrison and Beatles and the Stones and that sort of stuff. He grew up, and he those times he liked Van Morrison and Marty liked Rory Gallagher, the musician there. Yeah, and that's all the musicians back in it. And then it was Thin Lizzy in the 70s, a good band as well. Thin Lizzy. Yeah. Thin Lizzy, and then there was there's also Gaelic music like Enya Clannad. They were famous in Ireland. Donegal, and also, is that right?
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Do you want to come back on any of those points?
No, I think you're right, Kevin. That's the sort of the legendary canon that, as it were, studs the 60s into the 70s, isn't it, and continues apace. We it seems as if sort of Ireland and Northern Ireland, we get a couple of export stars that occupy the limelight for a bit, and then they kind of recede, and then it begins apace again. But, but it invites interest in parallels between things happening in the 60s, because I mean, O'Neill needed something. He didn't really have a lot of options. And I think, you can see similar kinds of modus operandi with, say, Van Morrison's involvement in the campaigns for peace during the paramilitary ceasefire. Although I think it came to light relatively recently, didn't he, that he didn't actually bequeath the songs for free. He charged the Northern Ireland state a pricely sum for the use of songs for peace, as it were. So yeah, make of that what you will. But thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Keith, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, fantastic paper, and it's just great being able to come as an outsider and listen to things that I wouldn't normally get to, being based over in England, in Manchester. But yes, it's a great paper. What I wanted to ask, I was thinking about the publication City Week, because if you look on this side of the water, like the Mersey Beat, for example, in Liverpool, that wasn't an industry publication. Bill Harry had developed that, so that was kind of an organic grassroots publication. And I just wondered, did you have an equivalent in Belfast to Mersey Beat? Because I know City Week would have been constructed in that way, but I'm wondering, first of all, was there an alternative to that? And secondly, given the kind of divisions in Belfast that were developing just after this period, I just wondered whether, was there any wider knowledge of what was being done at this time in terms of constructing beat music around Northern Irish identity? And I was just wondering, was there opposition to, from some parts of the city or across Northern Ireland to say, well, we don't want to attach this music to Northern Ireland. We want to attach it to Ireland and Irishness. So that would be my second point. And just the final point on this, I was interested in what you said about Astral Weeks, because I was just wondering, did that, when Astral Weeks was released and in those early years of Van's kind of international success, was it the case that he was being connected to a sense of Northern Irishness? I know that comes a lot later, and you talk about the peace process and everything else, but I wasn't aware that was happening in the late 60s and early 1970s. So just 3 points there, but great. Enjoyed the presentation. Really interesting.
Great questions, and in a way it brings me back to Guy's point. In a way, it's about the reading of the images at Stormont and what audiences would have taken from that. I mean, similarly, what did audiences take from the Stones at the Mall, Buckingham Palace in the background? But yeah, I think Astral Weeks, you see, it wasn't necessarily read as an Irish album initially. I mean, and I think even for many American fans in a contemporary context, many don't know that Van Morrison's Irish. And I think that was certainly the case, because Astral Weeks was a very slow burn record. He obviously parted ways with Phil Solomon. But what he did was he was actually picked up by one of Solomon's friends and associates, Bert Burns. And that's what Joanna was referring to with the Jewish transatlantic network. Because, I mean, the history of Jews and rock and roll, I'd refer you to Michael Billig's wonderful book of that name, Jews and Rock and Roll. Wonderful book, because it starts to relate Jews' relationship to the music business to a history of persecution post-World War II. And it resulted in Jews who were unwelcome in Wall Street beginning to find areas where they were more welcome. And the music business was one. And initially, Jews before Dylan, etc., were more content to work, or positioned by history to work in behind-the-scenes capacities. But what becomes interesting, I think, with your lovely question about City Week, I mean, it's in rhyme and meter, it matches Merseybeat, doesn't it? City Week, Merseybeat. It's a willful pastiche, but it's by an orthodox publishing group. It's not a fanzine. It's not by the kids for the kids, but it has to look like it's by the kids for the kids, which makes it more suspicious. And I mean, we could follow John True's editorials through. I mean, they get very controversial. Like, the most troublesome one is when, about 6 months before, there's the attempt to instigate the first Race Relations Act in the UK at the end of 65. John True writes an editorial about, rather dubiously phrased one, about why Northern Ireland doesn't need a Race Relations Act. And so you get these movements where it's all sort of like trying to be quite funky, and then it'll chime with the conservative agenda of the one-party state at certain points. So it's definitely not a fanzine. And then you see the absence of fanzines throughout the 60s and the absence of countercultural energy. And that becomes suspicious. So why is it that music gets funneled into general statements? Like, I think our favourite's Rory Gallagher's and Taste's Blister on the Moon. You know, stop telling the kids what to do sort of song. You know, brilliant musically. Rory's a virtuoso. If one was being unkind, I guess lyrics just weren't always a strong suit. But you hear in that record, you know, that he might have wanted to say something else, but then it becomes dangerous to start to lock horns with civil rights. But the positioning of civil rights, I mean, if Northern Ireland was joining in with the countercultural energy at the end of the decade, you would have expected to have seen more of the equivalent of songs like Street Fighting Man. You'd start to see some semblance of taking a side in the argument. That doesn't happen. David McWilliams is the exception. And because he's the only person writing lyrics that you would call culturally, politically, and historically specific. Because he's hammering into the failures of the technocracy, the days of Pearly Spencer, Time of Trouble, Redundancy Blues. All these songs are actually having a go, which is what you'd expect of the 60s in any normal Western European democracy. But I mean, folks, I mean, have a go, and in case we've missed something, tell us the ones that we haven't looked at that engage with any semblance of specifics. I mean, I'd love to know what they are, what they're there, but this is where McWilliams stands out. But then it's interesting that heritage is our institutionalized form of memory. If it name checks McWilliams, he's just like a talented Dylan derivative, a sort of a Northern Irish Donovan, in the way that, you know, them were this. But you see, Solomon was canny enough. He knew if he wanted to have a Northern Ireland Stones, they had to go deeper. And we know the evidence now. I mean, Baby Please Don't Go is more audacious as a record than what the Stones were doing at the same time. I mean, we might all think in our memory, oh, Satisfaction must come before Baby Please Don't Go. No, it comes after. And the historians of the music business and the studio system note that the big talking point in circles was Morrison's voice and delivery and Bert Burns' production signature. Because Bert Burns gives Baby Please Don't Go this funky, semi-Latin undercarriage. Like everybody talks in that film about that song about Morrison's voice and Billy Harrison's controversial guitar riff. Because whether it was Billy Harrison or Jimmy Page and all that, I can tell everybody
It's Billy Harrison.
It's definitely Billy Harrison. I have it from sitting with Jimmy Page and asking him, and he was unambiguous.
We were also gifted the opportunity of actually hearing the original demo as played by Billy Harrison in the studio for them at the time. It is Billy Harrison playing it. Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of things there, but I mean, he gave that track. Morrison's vocal is so much deeper than Jagger, so much more sounding like a 50-something Mississippian than a guy from Belfast who's 20. And then when you listen to that funky undercarriage, and whether it's Ronnie Millins who's playing the drums or celebrated sessionaires at Bobby Graham, it's wonderful. You can dance to it at a dance floor in a way that you can't really dance to The Last Time by the Stones, which is the Stones' parallel single. So Solomon always had to go deeper, and Mick Williams goes deeper. Mick Williams goes actually into being critical. So the imperatives of music and politics intertwine uneasily. They're not just Humpty Dumpty made something fall off a wall. It's not a crude cause and effect chain. It's there's an animating zeitgeist pushing things in a particular direction. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
Yeah, but the days of Pearly Spencer as well, you know, through the kind of lens of history, we may now remember that as the Mark Almond single, which actually has an extra verse added to the end of it by Mark Almond himself to make it a more uplifting song. The final verse on the Mark Almond version is not the David McWilliams. But we had a long conversation with David McWilliams' wife at the time, who was also a musician, and she kind of sketched in the background of the Days of Pearly Spencer song and what was going on at the time with David McWilliams, where he was politically, who he was as a person, how critical he was of the state, and very quiet, kind of unshowy way. So it really gave us a sense that he was an oppositional force at the time. And also to come back to your first question about geographical designation. I mean, it's a kind of a Rolodex whenever you start getting into it, because as people often talk about the famous advert in the Belfast Telegraph for them at the Maritime, they're designated on that as Ireland's rhythm and blues specialists, which was actually Emerald Records sign off kind of line on it. It was Ireland's specialists in whatever type of music. Then they have to go and join the British invasion. Then they get to Ready, Steady, Go, and they're described as a band from Belfast. Then we have sort of running parallel with that O'Neill's pamphlet campaign for the States about Ulster's connection with the how many American presidents. There's a whole PR campaign going on in the background. So it's effectively pick and mix as it kind of suits them. You know, they'll swap kind of chameleon-like designation depending on how it's going to either work for them politically or commercially within the territories. Solomon was canny enough to realise that the Irish designation held much more weight in the States, particularly in the light of Kennedy being president. You know, it was cool to be kind of Irish, it was cool and trendy, but he knew that wasn't going to play out well in Britain, and it wasn't going to play out well in Northern Ireland. And in fact, it doesn't even play out well with certain members of the band who start to get annoyed about it, as we've read in an interview. So there's a kind of Rolodex of chameleon-like identities that they're just pulling on, relating to whatever territory, whatever situation they happen to be in. They're playing a very clever insider game of understanding what designations work in what territories.
Yeah, indeed. To follow up with that, I mean, it's the Irish sobriquet is the one that they end up favouring. So it taps into all the insidious stereotypes that film scholars have written about. Liz Curtis has written about, you know, the fighting Irish, the violent Irish. They end up trading on that. And the complexity for O'Neill here, and again, we have to imagine a telephone call between Terence and Phil or a lunch in a gentleman's club, because Northern Ireland's invested under Brookborough in de-Irishifying itself. Hence the new Ulster project, hence Ulster Television, because Northern Ireland was deemed to be too much connected to Ireland. But you can imagine, O'Neill would have to be convinced about, well, God, we've just spent a fortune de-Irishifying ourselves, and now you're wanting to run off with this use of the Irish sobriquet, and then, yeah, but Terence, we need that. That's what's going to sell, because in England, no one gives a crap. In the States, no one knows what Ulster is. And that became a major paradox and that again suggests a less mechanical relationship and begins to suggest that the tensions between O'Neill and Solomon, or the politician and the showman, were embedded. The cracks were embedded there, just as the cracks were embedded in them as a group. They were supposed to be a collective, but they weren't four guys that were mates like the Beatles. They were musicians that had a prior track record with Solomon Inc. I mean, Billy Harrison had played for Bridie Gallagher, who Solomon managed, and the two Macaulay brothers. They joined the band, brilliant musicians, brilliant family of musicians, but they are Catholic. And then the band semiotically begins to represent the 60-40 split of Northern Ireland's religious divide. There's 3 Protestants and 2 Catholics. And, there's interesting games afoot in terms of what's being represented to the general public. This image of a new Ulster and a band that's a collective, because there's no better. I mean, Them is one of the great band names in the history of bands, isn't it? It's, if the Beatles cleverly signified collectivity by all looking the same and having uniforms and so on, then there was this sense with Them, we'll go deeper into collectivization. We'll move away from the something. So if the Beatles moved away from Cliff and the Shadows, Elvis and the Jordanaires, Tommy Steele and the Cavemen, Them just abandoned the of the title. Very, 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 very sophisticated. I mean, the only person we know historically that's capable of this sort of stuff is none other than Les Perrin, the genius of musical PR. Who, incidentally, coincidence, worked for Phil Solomon.
I can see, sorry to come in, I can see Victoria's been waiting for quite a while, so we might make this the last question. So Victoria, if you're still there.
Sorry, Victoria. Sorry,
Victoria. Yep, sorry.
Everything.
Sorry, Victoria, can't hear you.
Hi, Victoria.
Well, I'm just trying to unmute everything here. Listen, guys, thanks so much for such an interesting paper and great discussion afterwards. My mind is just absolutely swimming with ideas, and I can't wait to get hold of the book. Just though I would take you up on one point, Noel, just one crow to pick on you, to say that the show bands were somehow old hat or old fashioned. I would contend that you must never have done the Hucklebuck in your life. And if you have done it wrong, sir.
Victoria, you know us not. Any given Friday evening, all it takes is the first few bars of the Hucklebuck, and we're up giving it up.
Right, actually, right the next time you're in Belfast, and I'll come over with my blue suede shoes. But
it's a date. Hucklebucky under the table.
What I was going to ask was, I suppose, as a historian of the 18th century, I can really sympathize with you in terms of, having to cast your net far and wide in search of evidence and in search of sources. And, how a picture can present itself, but you're left there then with this tantalizing, this tantalizing feeling that, exactly as Noel said, if you could just find that one letter or that 1 minute of that meeting, it would just unlock so much for you and put your research on a more sure founding. But in saying that, I suppose that's my question. Again, did you have time, or do you have plans maybe ever to look at Solomon's relationship with the Irish government at the time, or any political parties that were operating in, let's say, the South? I'm just thinking, it just comes to mind, how prominent it was in his career for somebody like Albert Reynolds to have started off in the late 50s, early 60s, promoting show bands around the country. And in some ways, it seemed when you were talking that, O'Neill and the Stormont government were really on the back foot, catching up, let's say, not just with the Irish government and the way that they were promoting modernity under Lamass in the 1960s. And a big part of that was, I suppose, you mentioned the Bachelors, and then you had Makeup and Clancy and their relationship with Bob Dylan and what that said about the civil rights movement, and the popularity of that Irish folk music too, how that came into like a kind of a pop genre with the Dubliners and those sort of bands. But also I would suggest that like the Catholic Church in some ways had kind of catched on to this sort of the popularity of pop music. I think particularly about Father Horan in Mayo, who was running dances in a bid, to build up to bring I suppose interest into the west of Ireland, but also a lot of those dance halls founded Knock Airport. Yeah. So in some ways is O'Neill on the back foot, and also is it that, again, it was really interesting what you were saying, that it suited them sometimes to play the Irish card and sometimes to play the UK card. Was O'Neill, in some ways, was he trying to develop, as the Irish government had been promoting all these folk bands, were they trying to latch onto something in this sort of early kind of manifestation of Britpop, that there was a certain culture? And you've answered that question, I suppose, but also, was there some way that they were trying to find a commonality? It was some sort of popular youth like culture that they could use if there was ever, and controversially, if there was ever a question of a united Ireland, was there some way of finding a commonality? Does that make sense?
I think my favourite line on this, and it's one to kind of to muse on, they say that politics is rock and roll for ugly people.
Yeah. Reynolds cornered the market on that, really, didn't he?
There's a crossover, I definitely think with that. And yes, as you can see, as soon as a kind of O'Neill and Solomon's relationship broke down, he ran straight to the Irish state. He went straight to the top of government. And you're right about the kind of crossover between the politicians who were using music in Ireland to push an idea of modernity. And some of them, as you quite rightly say, had been active. They knew the business. I think a lot of the time people they think kind of music sits apart in a kind of artistic sphere that's disconnected from the particularly the economics and the PR version. But like we haven't included in this talk, but in other ones we do talk about, when you look at the Beatles were mentioned far more times in the British Parliament in 64, 65 than Northern Ireland was. What was it, 10 times more? Yep. And even recently, I just read a report on Saturday, they're saying, the biggest entertainment contributors, it was a report from HMRC, British Government Taxes, they named 4 entertainment outfits that were still contributing to the British economy today. And it was Robbie Williams, Adele, Ed Sheeran, and the Beatles. Yeah. Still, the Beatles are contributing significantly to the British economy. And back in the 60s, I mean, we actually went through, there's a section in the book where we go through the actual economics of what the Beatles were contributing. And I mean, we questioned ourselves on this. And I think actually the way to look at it is from the reverse angle is, why would O'Neill not want something like this?
Yeah, because it'd been successful for everybody around him, not to pursue it, it.
No, and you're thank you, Victoria. I must also kind of talk about the Hucklebuck, because I mean, I'm in no way casually anti-show band. I'm
glad to hear it.
We love show bands.
I always think it's a laziness of Irish rock discourse to kind of blame show bands for being backward and so on. That's kind of very overstated, because even if the heritage materials which counsel that them was a sea change and all of a sudden everybody's doing things credibly, them were put back in the box. The R&B scene was put back in the box really quickly. The show bands continued apace for years and dominated the life.
always fascinated me about the show bands, particularly in a Northern Ireland context, is we have this love affair with punk music, particularly in Belfast and in Derry in the 70s, as being the music that defines, you know, the Troubles period in Northern Ireland. But I would suggest that, you know, show band music at the time was sort of nearly as akin to a music of rebellion, because I think in terms of my own parents and my in-laws here in Derry, they weren't getting dressed up in a Saturday night and driving over the border with all the connotations that that would hold for you at the time in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s in Derry to see, you know, a punk band. They were going to see the show bands all through the Troubles. You know, people were braving crossing the border, braving going outside of their home place to dance to show band music. You know, it was one of the when the army would come in to cut you down or to cut you off at 11 o'clock, it was normally a show band that they were stopping rather than any, you know, raucous punk group. So I think in some ways they've been overlooked in that.
No, I think
as well, Victoria, you know, I mean, this is a very kind of personal story for me because I come from a family of musicians who played in these bands in the 60s and 70s, and you know, we kind of like to look back and see these very definite divisions between kind of cool beat music and all the show bands were terrible. That wasn't true. They were working musicians. They were hopping between show bands, beat groups, R&B. Morrison himself was in 3 show bands before he got to them. They were working musicians. They wanted.
Even somebody like Rory Gallagher starts off on the show band scene. And
I mean, what's interesting though is, I mean, the analogy, I think that if we're talking more politically and economically here, the analogy with Solomon is Solomon's a little bit like a precursor to Google or to Apple. You know, Solomon's not interested in national allegiances per se. Yeah. You know, he wasn't interested in the border. That just gets in the way of business. But similarly, O'Neill had to make a decision because the senior partner in this is Phil Solomon, not Terence O'Neill in one way.
Yeah.
I mean, O'Neill needs Solomon more than Solomon needs O'Neill, in a way. And so O'Neill's put in the position of having to, a bit like national governments at the minute, how do you administer neoliberal capitalism and huge global consortiums appropriately? I mean, they can't even get the bastards to pay tax in the current context, you know. But you have that because, in a way, the show band system is more about live play and folk having fun, and that dominates the playing economy. But Solomon's thing, if you stay with the Apple Google idea, is to get people to buy new kinds of tech. So you want to start a recording industry. Show bands are less interested in records. The new beat groups are all about records. Show bands aren't really about export. Okay, there are exceptions. The Royal go over to the States and all of that. The Clipper Carlton have some degree of international success, but it's not. The beat industry is all about outward facing. Northern Ireland's just, the local market's just one constituency. So there's a sort of a sense now in changing, finding new markets, new territories, new ways of selling stuff, and then also selling new shit on the ground. Yeah. Studio sessions.
Yeah.
Different.
I think it's important there, Noel, to point out, you know, the Solomons, they owned record shops, they owned brown goods shops, they were selling transistors, were the kind of iPad of the day. A lot of their advertising at the time is pushing a lot of that. So, you know, there is a kind of vertically integrated model of where the Solomons have business interests. So they're not only selling the transistors, but they also own the radio station.
Yeah, that's why I think it'd be interesting to maybe see, you know, if there's any minutes or reports or letters or anything surviving with the Irish government as well. Not in a sectarian way, Irish government for government, but just to see the extent of his connections and his influence at the time, you know, and I'm sure they're there, and I'm sure it's extensive, absolutely extensive. Yeah. Just one point in closing, because I know Peter's probably anxious to get rid of us. So just one point in closing, and when you're talking about coincidences, Rory Gallagher, though born in Ballyshannon, is claimed as a son of Cork City, where I'm from myself, and he was a neighbour of my family in an area of the city centre that is locally known as Jewtown. So maybe Solomon has a connection there as well. So
very, very probably. I mean, and thank you very, very much Victoria, because I mean, we know a little bit about Solomon's connections to Westminster. I mean, he was confident enough in his connections in the upper echelons of Westminster to flaunt those in the face of he was misidentified in a traffic accident or a traffic offence when back home in Belfast. And he didn't just say to the RUC that he'd have the message raised, he'd have the issue raised with the one-party state. He was name checking Westminster, and that's a matter of public record. So he had confidence in central government and his connections there. But you see, the other danger with a thing like this is all roads eventually, with something like the music business, point towards illicit capitalism, as does the history of one Charles Hockey.
Yeah.
and
We don't think in those terms. We don't think in those terms, but they are. Your point is brilliantly made. They are there.
Well, I mean, it pops up in the Solomon story that he had, shall we say, very dubious friends, and that comes up in. It's a wonderful book I'd recommend to you. Is Jackie Macaulay's memoir, I Sideman. He talks about his days in them and his career, but he crosses into Solomon's dodgy friends, and I mean, it's just like he names it for what it is. These folk are mafia. Mm-hmm. They're Soho club owners. They're break your legs people, and but then you're into another territory. You're not writing an academic monograph. You're writing a Scorsese film or something like that from the 70s, and
Sorry, folks. I'm going to have to. Thanks, Victoria. We have run over our allotted time by quite a significant amount. I'm sure we could go on for a lot longer. Been fantastic questions and such a really interesting subject. So thank you all very much for participating. Thanks especially to Joanna and Noel for speaking to us this afternoon. I know that you're speaking again as part of the Imagine Festival next month.
We are, yes.
On the Charlie Is My Darling film.
Yes, we're going to go into, if anybody's kind of had the appetite whetted by this, we're going to go into a huge degree more detail of the Charlie Is My Darling saga, which does actually unfold like a Scorsese film script. So if you're interested in kind of behind the scenes dealings, people, mobsters, stolen tapes, people, illicit drug deals, Acid King Dave, people having nervous breakdowns, Abbey Lou Goldman leaving the music business, Peter Whitehead. It has it all, honestly, in terms of like excitement. It is a rip-roaring kind of story that we couldn't believe when we uncovered it. And then, when you find out it's made in Belfast and Dublin in '65 and nobody's heard of it, it's a special kind of talent to hide that sort of film. It even includes the founding father of the state, of the Northern Ireland state, not Craig, but Carson. And Carson's friendship with Oscar Wilde, which connects to the Stones and Peter Whitehead. So, I hope that one's appetite.
So there you are. So there's another event not to miss. That's in the Imagine Festival online, which is run out of Belfast next month. Before everyone else goes, can I ask you just briefly to unmute yourselves and give a round of applause to Joanna and Noel.
Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks again, folks. Just for those of you who are left, we don't have a seminar next week, but then in 2 weeks we have Victoria Pearson, who's going to speak to us on a different sort of rock and roll, breaking the penal laws, the life and work of Francis Moylan, 1735 to 1815. So we have an Eventbrite up to sign in for that. So hopefully we'll see some people in a couple of weeks' time for that event as well. Thank you all for participating again. Thank you, Joanna and Noel, and good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Nice